Court weighed into, well, we do agree that individuals have the right to keep and bear arms. Let's not worry about the purpose of the prefatory clause, not necessarily being a limiting clause. But still, even under that standard, the constitutional right is not absolute. Whenever you're looking at constitutional rights, you're looking at 3 levels of scrutiny. The strictest one is strict scrutiny, which requires compelling justification. By and large, you can look at it as sort of a rationalization. If you're reading a Supreme Court opinion, you're saying, we need to apply strict scrutiny under this. They're saying basically we want to find against it. Okay, case over. The lightest one of all is a rational basis. You can think of that as, well, we're going to have a rationalization for whatever we want to accomplish. This is the political purpose of the Supreme Court. And then intermediary basis is something called a reasonable basis. If you read in the Supreme Court's opinion, they're talking about a reasonable basis. You don't know what the outcome is. You need to turn to the last page to get to the end of the story. Okay? So you start with the Supreme Court opinion, they're saying this requires strict scrutiny. You don't need to read the last page, case over. Whatever it was, failed strict scrutiny. A rational basis is going to pass, reasonable basis we don't yet know. Interestingly, in the Heller case, the Supreme Court didn't tell us what test they used, right? Yet that's been critical in every other constitutional analysis. Yes, sir?
Point of clarification. Are you saying that Scalia and the Supreme Court in 2008 said, and now fill in the blank again, that D.C. could or could not have handguns?
No, they overturned the D.C. regulation.
So that you could have a handgun?
Yes, because the purpose of it was, it created a constitutional right, very limited purpose here. An individual has a constitutional right to possess a handgun for defense in their home. Okay? So that's as broad as the Second Amendment has been interpreted. So much of the stuff that we're talking about, nowhere will the Supreme Court, even the present Supreme Court, support. Okay? So the idea of AK-47s being lawful, no, that's not even what this present Supreme Court is supporting. Okay? There's every reason to believe that it would survive executive order or survive, should you get Congress to pass it, survive constitutional scrutiny should the Supreme Court, or should Congress say that AK-47s are illegal, right? Going on into the dissent, we had Stevens' dissent, which looked at the first part of that and said the whole purpose of the Second Amendment is to have a well-regulated militia. There is no individual right. And then Breyer, who was trying to sound like the middle ground there, said, no, I think that we need to apply a reasonable test, and I would support D.C.'s regulation because their interest was compelling. So the constitutional levels that we were talking about before, that felons shouldn't own guns, mentally ill shouldn't own guns, schools shouldn't own guns, and nor should they be in, they shouldn't be in schools, nor should they be in government buildings, are all still supportable. The idea that somehow there's a God-given right to keep and bear arms is not something even the Supreme Court would support. So we're talking about, within the context of executive power, certainly every president since George Washington has done something with executive power. Some are more active than others. President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. President Lincoln used emancipation of slaves. That was executive power. So it's pretty doggone strong power. And that's even before the more recent case of the Chadha case. Under executive power, FDR interred 120,000 Japanese Americans. So I'm not saying executive power is always well used, but it is a strong power. He also launched much of the New Deal by executive order because he was not getting support in Congress. Truman took over the nation's steel mills. Eisenhower desegregated the schools. What happened in Little Rock was because of executive order. Kennedy and Johnson both barred racial discrimination in federal housing, and Reagan forbid the use of federal funds to advocate for abortion. All those were executive order decisions. The courts are always very generous in finding congressional action for authorization of executive acts. Only twice in the nation's history has executive orders been overturned. And all of them have been passed, only twice. And the Chadha decision was very instrumental because it says legislation, you think about an executive order passing, Congress is up in arms, they pass a law saying, you can't do that. The Chadha decision said that law has to go to the president for veto power, right? So a president says, I'm going to do this. Congress says, you can't do that. Now it has to go to him to say, okay, I can't do that, right? So effectively what it requires is a 2/3 majority of Congress to overturn an executive order. So when we're talking about a supermajority in Congress, when we're talking about filibuster rules, the reality in D.C. is Obama could do anything he wants. Any president could do anything he wants, so long as he thinks it will survive a 2/3 majority. Okay? Which is pretty good, particularly even in this Congress. So, in a case called Youngstown versus Sawyer, for executive action to be enforceable, it must be an emergency, and Congress must not have said no. So you look to congressional history, you look at the laws, and there's no place where they said you can't do that, and the president has the authority to act. Justice Jackson has several different layers of scrutiny to look at there. But, and so the bottom line is that pretty much anything could be done, and then you sort of stare down Congress to say you got 2/3 to override me. Let's see what you bring up here. The present moves that I understand President Obama is talking about, compared to what President Clinton did, are all somewhat meager, I think. President Clinton's executive action banned the importation of more than a dozen makes of assault weapons, such as variations of the AK-47. Pretty gritty, teethy stuff. He entered an order banning the importation of certain makes of so-called assault pistols. President Obama is talking about improving federal mental health programs, requiring federal agencies to send to a national database, all good stuff. Ordering the Justice Department to step up prosecutions for people caught lying on forms used for background checks. Apparently there aren't prosecutions going on right now.
That's right.
And using using a resource appointment power to install a director of Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. So, relatively meager stuff compared to what can be done, knowing that you could challenge them down to a 2/3 majority. So part of the reason why this becomes intensely personal for me comes from watching, in the context of family law to begin with, perhaps sort of two different ways people go. Freud talks about it from a thanatos perspective, is the way that I've identified it, a death wish. Why do we have a death wish, perhaps within our marriages, perhaps within society at large? The folks in this congregation know me as a very activist in environmental issues. Why are we willing to annihilate ourselves as a species within that context? In the gun issue, there's one purpose of a gun, and that's to kill something. You look at that lifeless thing, and people say, guns don't kill people, people kill people. It's that gun that's doing the work. What is the attachment to that? And I do mean that from a psychological standpoint. What's the attachment to that you can't sleep without? My sister used to call her blanket her suppin, right? So what is that suppin to people that has them so engaged to it, that thanatic tendency? And the personal part comes from Knoxville, where a madman marched into a Unitarian church and gunned down parishioners. And that really brought it home for me. So, what can we do from where I sit? You talked about Glock, and growing up in Smyrna, Glock's very personal to me. One of the things we can do is daily protest at Glock. Gun lovers love Glock. Make a great firearm. It's very reliable, rarely jams. You could really do a lot just by being a Glock, because you know you won't be alone for long. You're going to call out the worst of the worst to come out there and counter you. And then the media's guided circus that wants to show. All right, and here's where it gets really cold. And perhaps the worst will happen, and perhaps it will carry the battle forward. So daily protests at Glock. We were talking earlier about, many of you may recall, it was not that long ago in the memory of this state that it was kind of funny to go to a bar, toss back a few, be kind of drunk, get in your car and hope you make it home. That was okay. There was nothing socially wrong with being toasted and driving. And some angry mothers changed everything. They made drinking a shameful activity when you got behind the car. And I think there's tremendous power in shaming the possession and use of firearms. I can see an argument, a strong argument, for trying to make NRA synonymous with KKK.
Yeah.
Okay, bad folks. And LaPierre makes it easy for us. You know, they could be so much more rational about it, but that's not where they want to go. So take advantage of the opportunity. City resolutions have always been wonderful, wonderful things. You know, if it's a resolution, the city's always worried about, but our legal costs if we get sued. Resolution has no binding power, therefore there's nothing that someone can sue them for. But it's a will of the people statement. And it's done awfully well in every city that it's ever been brought up. So in your own little cities, raise the issue. And finally, from our neck of the woods, wrongful death suits for negligent storage. You're talking about when we go to a crime scene and somebody's stolen a gun from some idiot that collects guns and didn't secure them at all. And he got broken into and suddenly all his guns are gone. But so that you guys know how far out on the left I am for repeal of the Second Amendment so that we don't even have to worry about a Supreme Court coming up with a different interpretation in years to come. We don't need it anymore.
That'll take a little longer.
Yeah, it'll take a little longer. We gotta start somewhere.
Okay, that's a good segue to my first question. Can you hear me? Is the mic on?
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank all of you. You bring some very good perspectives, different perspectives for us, and I just learned a whole lot. But let's take that last comment, or the Second Amendment conversation that Michael brought up. So, you know, you just stated a very left position, and there's people that have very right positions, if you will, on the right to bear arms. So how do we, you know, it once again brings up the issue of polarization in our society. So how do we begin to engage in dialogue with people who have different points of view around the constitutionally protected right to bear arms? I mean, how do you begin a conversation with someone whose viewpoints are different than yours? And if you want to talk about that, because I'm sure you experienced that down at the Capitol. And
Oh, no. I'll be glad to start.
Where do you go?
I'll be glad to start. I think it depends on who it is. For instance, I think it depends on who it is. If the conversation is with your next door neighbor or your second cousin or someone with whom you already have a relationship, I think you'll be astonished to discover that if you keep your rhetoric reasonable, if you maintain, you know, a calm level, which Unitarians of course are famous for, you will find that that people really do understand this thing about the background check. That there really is a resonance around that I've been astonished by with that group of folks. And just starting from there is a way to understand not only how they feel, but also also a way to demonstrate how logical this really is. Nobody should have a gun except if they pass a background check. Pretty reasonable. But if you start to talk about some of the high interest groups around this issue, groups like, and I'm going to call the names of some of them, and Kathryn I think can call some others, GeorgiaCarry.org, the Sons of Liberty, Students for Guns on Campus,
Yes.
or Concealed Carry on Campus.
Yeah.
These are all organizations that show up at the General Assembly. I texted my boss the other day. I was actually representing Atlanta Police, and I said, you know, I don't get paid enough to spend 2.5 hours listening to these people in House Public Safety Committee as they gave their constitutional assessments in the history of Georgia and, you know, all that. But, and those folks don't believe anything we're saying. There's no basis for sort of common logical conversation with those folks. And you just, you know, you stay away from them, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, they wear big orange stickers, homemade sort of orange stickers that say "Guns Save Lives." You know, and so you know those folks are you know, there's a fundamental underlying racism in what they do.
Yes.
Their idea, but you can hear it in the way they talk, that law-abiding citizens are white guys. And anybody who isn't is suspect.
Right.
And they really do believe that law enforcement can walk into a room and tell who the criminals are from the law-abiding citizens just by looking at them, which of course is not the case. So those conversations are best avoided, I think. But in terms of outreach, in terms of looking for and finding common ground, there's more than there ever was. And I spend a lot of time talking to law enforcement folks who, you know, have kind of a gritty sort of, you know, a feel about, and a warped sort of sense about the world because of what they do every day. understandably because of what they do every day. And even those guys, some of them are knuckleheads, will say to me, yeah, well, on this universal background check thing, on this background check thing, yeah, I get that. That really makes some sense. I would only add, I think, that the discussion usually winds up being about me first, me alone, my stuff, my life, my. And it's a variation on greed, right? It's a variation on the idea that everybody is absolutely an individual, and if we have responsibilities to each other, it ends at some point, because if it interferes with anything, there's that idea that somehow we don't all have to live together. And you know that's not accurate. I was raised Roman Catholic. The idea of a corporate community was ingrained in us from little on. The idea that somehow we are all in this together, whether some folks acknowledge that or not. And I think that's the spirit in which we're going to see this change around gun policy.
Next question? No, I think that's.
Let me just ask one more question, and then I want to open it up to the audience, because this was touched on as well. Some persons believe that the focus on gun regulation has shifted attention away from where it needs to be, which is addressing the problem of improved mental health resources and safety in schools. Can we repeat that, Bonnie? The question is, I want to know what the panelists' take is on the assertion by some people that the focus on gun control or gun regulation has sort of, we've taken our eye off what the real issues are, and the real issues are improved mental health resources and improved safety in schools. And I just wanted to know if any of you would like to comment on that.
Well, okay. Okay. I think that is a wonderful idea. We need to focus on mental health. And we need to start by talking about putting into the diagnostic, was it DSM, right? Is it diagnostic manual? The gun addiction is a mental health issue. Because when it's this attachment that you can't let go of as a rational basis. This is killing folks. This is a bad thing, right? No, I got to hang on to it. Mine, right? Like you're talking about. So when we're talking about mental health of folks, obviously the most extreme of the fringe are doing the Newtown things. And you think about what he did to his mother before he ever even went into that place. But backing up to his mom, from what I understand, she had kind of an apocalyptic sense of the world, and that's why she had the guns in the first place. So going back to the source, it is the need to have that gun to feel safe. You know, that fear of your lack of wholeness if you don't have that weapon. So I think talking about this as a mental health issue is exactly where we want to go.
Kathryn, I know you want to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, a friend of mine who was a former professor at Valdosta State recently attended a workshop that was given to faculty and staff. And the woman who conducted it was, or still is actually, a school counselor. And she reported alarmingly high rates of students who were coming in distressed, suicidal, having problems with drugs or alcohol. So the response when we're talking about being able to provide resources, I think it's really important, and I see that schools are starting to do this. There were reports of I believe junior high or middle schools this week that were providing resources for teachers also. And so there's this wave of or increased sensitivity around making sure that teachers have the resources that they need, and I think that that's terribly important. Also too, interestingly, in the case of Newtown and Aurora, Colorado, and Arizona, and actually Virginia Tech. The young men were